The next type of equation that we're going to look at in this section is solving an absolute value equation. So before we get started with this, I want to review with you very quickly what absolute value does to a number. Okay, so remember that absolute value has this symbol. Okay, that's the symbol that stands for absolute value. And remember that if you put a negative number inside an absolute value, it's going to turn that number positive. And also keep in mind that if you put a positive number inside an absolute value, it's going to keep it positive. So an absolute value will always return the positive part of what's inside the absolute value signs. Okay, so one thing that I want to point out to you before we get started is that if I have an equation that is, say, equal to 5, as we have right here, okay, this one's equal to 5 and this one's equal to 5. Note that there are two things that can go inside the absolute value signs and still produce an answer of 5. You can put a negative 5 in there, or you could put a positive 5 in there. And either one is going to give you the same answer out. So every time we're working with an absolute value equation, we're going to have to consider two possibilities. We're going to have to consider the possibility that what's inside the absolute value is negative, okay, as we see right here. And we're also going to have to consider that what's inside the absolute value is positive in terms of what we see here. All right, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and define an absolute value equation. So an absolute value equation, as we just said, is going to be solved by writing two different equations and solving them. It's going to graph a V. It usually has two answers, okay? It doesn't necessarily have to, but most of the time you will see it having two solutions. And as an example, we have the absolute value of x plus 4 is equal to 13. So that's the example that we're going to start with. X plus 4 is equal to 13. Remember that we solve an absolute value equation by writing two different problems. Okay, so the first problem that we're going to write is going to assume that what's inside the absolute value is positive. So in that case, if x plus 4 was already positive, I don't even really need the absolute value because it's like this scenario. If it was already positive, I really didn't need the absolute value to return it to the same number. It was already there. The other scenario is the case where what's inside the absolute value actually equaled negative 13, but the absolute value turned it positive. Okay, so to sum that up, what you're going to need to do is take your absolute value off, and you're going to set it equal to the positive number here and also the negative number there. Okay, so now we're going to solve these two equations. So I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides of this one. That's going to give me x is equal to 9 as an answer. And I'm going to subtract 4 over here, which is going to give me x is equal to negative 17. So remember, we said that most absolute value equations have two solutions, and that's what we're seeing here. X is equal to 9, and x is equal to negative 17. All right, let's try one other example. You do need the absolute value to be by itself on one side of the equation before you break it up into two different problems. So I want to show you one where it's not. We have the equation 8 and then times the absolute value of x minus 5. And then we have a plus 7 is equal to 11. We need to isolate that absolute value first before we start working the problem. So let's go ahead and begin by subtracting 7 from both sides. So that's going to give me 8 times the absolute value of x minus 5 is equal to 4. Right? Again, you need the absolute value by itself. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to divide both sides by this 8. So that's going to give me the absolute value of x minus 5 all by itself is equal to 4 over 8, which we know is 1/2. Once that's done, then we're ready to break it up into the two problems. So remember that one problem looks exactly like what we have right here. Okay, except that we don't have the absolute value. So x minus 5 equals 1/2. The other problem also has an x minus 5, but we're going to set it equal to the negative 1/2. Okay, so let's solve. So in both cases, we're going to need to add 5 to both sides. All right, so on problem number 1, x is now going to equal 5.5. Okay, adding the 5 to the 1/2. And so that's one answer. And then for our other answer, we're going to take 5 and we're going to subtract 1/2. So 5 minus 1/2 is 4.5. And that's going to give us our second solution. So again, on your absolute value equations, remember that you need the absolute value isolated on one side of the equation, and then you need to break it up into two separate problems and work those problems out.